Welcome to Beyond Time Conversations, the podcast where we bridge the gap between history and the present. I'm your host, and today we're joined by one of the most influential figures in the history of science. He was a naturalist, a geologist, and the author of On the Origin of Species. Mr. Charles Darwin, welcome to the program.
Thank you for this kind invitation. It is a curious experience to find myself speaking in this way, far removed from the quiet of my study at Down House. Still, I am pleased to be of service.
To begin, sir, your name is now synonymous with revolutionary science, yet your early path seemed destined for the church or medicine. Could you take us back to the time before the HMS Beagle and explain how a young theology student found himself circumnavigating the globe?
It was, in retrospect, a series of fortunate accidents. I first attempted to study medicine at Edinburgh, but I found the lectures unbearably dull and the surgical demonstrations deeply distressing. I simply could not tolerate the sight of blood. My father, fearing I would become an idle sporting man, sent me to Cambridge with the intention that I become a clergyman. But my interests lay elsewhere, in collecting beetles and studying botany. I became known there as the man who walks with Henslow, referring to Professor John Stevens Henslow, who was both mentor and friend. It was Henslow who received a letter from Captain Fitzroy, seeking a companion and naturalist for a survey voyage to South America. My father objected strongly, believing the journey a waste of time. But my uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, intervened and persuaded him otherwise. And so, despite my lack of formal training, I set sail.
That voyage lasted nearly 5 years and took you to South America, Australia, and eventually the Galapagos Islands. What observations during that journey first began to unsettle your belief in the fixity of species?
The realization was gradual rather than sudden. In Patagonia, I uncovered fossilized remains of immense extinct mammals, great ground sloths such as Megatherium, lying alongside shells of modern species. It struck me deeply that these ancient giants bore clear resemblance to the smaller armadillos living in the same region. Then there were the Galapagos Islands. I noticed that mockingbirds differed subtly from island to island, and the local governor told me he could identify a tortoise's home island simply by the shape of its shell. At the time, I must admit, I was not sufficiently diligent. I failed to label my finch specimens by island, believing them to be different species altogether. Only later, as I reflected on these facts during the return voyage, did I write in my notes that such observations, if true, would undermine the stability of species.
After returning to England, you spent many years developing your theory in private before publishing On the Origin of Species. Can you describe when the mechanism of natural selection became clear to you, and why you waited more than 20 years to make it public?
The key insight came to me in October of 1838, after I read an essay by Thomas Malthus on population. He argued that populations tend to increase faster than their food supply, leading inevitably to competition and struggle. Being well prepared by years of observation, it suddenly occurred to me that under such conditions, favorable variations would be preserved, while unfavorable ones would be destroyed. The result would be the gradual formation of new species. Still, I hesitated. To suggest that species were not immutable felt to me like confessing a crime. I feared prejudice and misunderstanding. So I devoted years to meticulous work, particularly my long study of barnacles, to establish my scientific credibility. I might have delayed even longer had Alfred Russel Wallace not sent me an essay in 1858 outlining the very same theory. At that point, I could no longer remain silent.
When On the Origin of Species appeared in 1859, it sparked immediate controversy, especially regarding religion and human ancestry. How did you personally endure being caricatured, criticized, and attacked by religious authorities?
I was largely spared from direct confrontation by my poor health. The excitement of public controversy often left me ill for days at a time. I depended greatly on my friends, Charles Lyell, Joseph Hooker, and especially Thomas Huxley, who defended the theory publicly with great vigor. As for religion, my views changed slowly and painfully. I had once been quite orthodox, even quoting scripture aboard the Beagle, but the death of my beloved daughter Annie was devastating. I could no longer reconcile such suffering with belief in a benevolent, omnipotent deity. I came to feel that the cruelty evident in nature, such as parasitic wasps laying their eggs inside living caterpillars, could not be the direct work of a compassionate creator. Over time, I settled into a position best described as agnostic.
In On the Origin of Species, you famously avoided direct discussion of humans, writing only that light will be thrown on the origin of man. Yet in 1871, you published The Descent of Man. What compelled you to finally address human evolution, and how did your views on race influence that work?
By then, others, including Huxley, had already demonstrated the anatomical continuity between humans and other primates. I felt it necessary to address the matter directly, to show that humanity, for all its nobility, bears the mark of its natural origins. I also wish to emphasize the unity of mankind. As a young man in Edinburgh, I learned taxidermy from John Edmonstone, a former slave, whom I found intelligent and thoughtful. Later, during the Beagle voyage, I encountered Fuegians who had been brought to England and educated. Their transformation made it clear to me that the difference between so-called savage and civilized peoples was cultural, not biological. The Descent of Man allowed me to argue that all human races belong to a single species, and that our superficial differences arise largely through sexual selection and circumstance.
In your later years, you turned your attention to subjects that might seem modest by comparison: earthworms, climbing plants, and small movements over long periods. Looking back, how would you now summarize your view of life on Earth?
I have always taken great satisfaction in observing the small and the gradual. My final book on earthworms showed how these humble creatures, through countless tiny actions over immense spans of time, reshaped the very soil beneath our feet. Life itself is much the same. There is a grandeur in this view of life, that from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been, and continue to be, evolved, all while this planet moves according to the fixed laws of nature.
Thank you, Mr. Darwin, for sharing your time and your remarkable journey with us.
You are most welcome. I hope our conversation has been of some use.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Beyond Time Conversations. We'll see you in the next era.